one. I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for having me today, and it's a pleasure to be here. Such an important topic. And I wanted to just take a few minutes, hopefully not too long, because I know I'm between me and the coffee, so I want to avoid that. To talk about Vietnam and talk about the study that we did as one of the major pieces of work. I think Vietnam is the first country at the World Bank to do a CCDR. And it's a very important institutional document now as part of our, the bank's basically role in the world. They want to very much be much more involved in greening and making the development and growth sustainable. So Vietnam, we're lucky enough to be the first country to have this study done. And so I'm just going to talk about a bit about what is in it, and then what we think in terms of fiscal policy going forward. So, I mean, it's a beautiful picture, right? It's a gorgeous country in many, many ways, and just wanted to kind of share that with you. But also, it's a country that is highly, highly vulnerable to climate change. Most of it comes from the fact that you have a very long coastline that exposes the country to future, water, ocean, rising of the ocean. If that happens. And also a large part of the country is, economy is built around the Mekong Delta. And as Delphine was pointing out, it's a very critical part of the economy for Vietnam, but also it's a very vulnerable part of the economy for Vietnam. Now, Vietnam itself has had a very historically low greenhouse gas emission, but this emission has been increasing really quickly. And one of the things, for example, the GDP multiplied by 4 or more in the last 20, 25 years. And what we've seen is that along with that, per capita emission have actually also quadrupled. Now, that's still not extremely high, but it's kind of a signaling to the government and to the population that potentially there may be a better way of continuing growth than focusing on than just continuing with the production of greenhouse gases. Now, the model that we have is that a projected temperature increase of between 1 to 3.4% could happen. And the heat stress on the population and on the nature would be very high. Especially in regards to population is a lot of diseases, right? A lot of diseases, a lot of new viri, new problems with health. Increases in extreme temperatures and events are very likely. Already, we're seeing more and more frequent cyclones. I remember when I moved to Vietnam in October of 2020, the country had experienced six cyclones within a month, which was extraordinary for them. The center of the country, where Da Nang is where they're really affected by most of these cyclones coming off of the ocean. And the damages were in the billions, right? I think a couple of $3 billion damage was caused. Thankfully, there wasn't that much human life loss, but still a very high cost. Now, the effect on production and productivity is obvious. I mean, you have a country that is the second or third largest exporter of rice. And a lot of the rice, of course, especially with Mekong Delta, there's a lot of production there. And this is already being affected by salination, by water rises. So the productivity of agriculture, generally speaking, would be affected, but especially of rice production potentially going forward. Now, effect on infrastructure and urban areas is obvious. Any of the infrastructure that is close to the coast or within the Mekong Delta could be affected. Especially, I wanted to point out that Vietnam has been extremely successful in bringing in a lot of FDI. A lot of these industrials, this FDI is based in industrial zones, and a lot of these industrial zones are located in the south, about 145 or 150 of them, and those could be potentially impacted by global climate change. Now, of course, just generally speaking, you will have then potential significant economic and human costs associated with global climate change. Now, the better news is that there are opportunities. There are still opportunities to mitigate and adapt and to continue to grow, right? But obviously, this is not going to be cheap. I think all of us agree the costs of adaptation and mitigations are going to be high. The issue is, how can we find the best ways and to kind of ensure potentially low-hanging fruits that could be very effective to start with, ways of investing and financing that could help the economies, especially developing economies, take advantage of the opportunities to adjust their production, to build better, more sustainable systems, and also protect their population. Now, the Country Climate and Development Report, as I mentioned to you, for Vietnam is the first that the bank has done. This was followed by China, it's followed by Philippines and a number of other countries. It will be part of our core analytical and policy instruments going forward, which we will then update on a regular basis every 3 to 5 years. So it asks really a whole bunch of questions associated with how to deal with this issue, right? So it's asking, how intensively should Vietnam work to adapt, given the uncertainty of global emissions? How much will it cost to actually reduce the emissions? How can the private sector be mobilized to help? And what are the trade-offs between economic growth and poverty reduction and climate action? And how can they be managed? Which sectors and regions should be focusing on? And what are the distributional impacts of a low-carbon, climate-resilient growth pact? These are the type of questions that are being asked in all of our CCDRs going forward. And of course, we want to acknowledge the fact that Vietnam has been at the forefront of this global climate change fight. And we have the government has committed to, has acknowledged, first of all, that this is a serious issue within its development agenda, and has recognized that it needs to shift its economic model to a new one which has more focus on climate and productivity increases and improved resilience of the economy. And that comes through their SCDC, which is their strategic development agenda for the next until 2030. It also has a green growth strategy that it was adopted. And at COP26, the Prime Minister announced that Vietnam intends to reach net zero carbon emission by 2050, which is a big challenge for the country. But they are intent, and they are very progressive and forward-looking in this area. So one of the issues also for Vietnam is that they produce a lot of their electricity through coal, and so their commitment has been that they will try to phase out coal production by 2040. Going forward, I just wanted to kind of bring back the topic that for Vietnam, given the commitments that they've made, I think they're making these commitments because I think in a sense they understand the economic cost of climate change can be huge for Vietnam, given its geography, and it's the spatial development that they have in the country at this point. So climate change actually could potentially derail Vietnam's ambitions to becoming high income by 2045. And the graph on the left-hand side, I'm sorry, the reference is missing there. What that is showing you, basically, there's a couple of different scenarios that have been run, of course, as part of the CCDR activities. These are economic, we use general economic models to run them. And so what you see there is actually two scenarios where the first is basically GDP loss percentage of deviation from baseline. So what this means is that if the temperature were to increase by 2% or by 2 to 3%, this would be the loss in the GDP loss for the economy, right? As of compared to the baseline. So that's what it means. So it could be pretty important. It could be up to 9% for the 2%, And it could be up to like 13% if the temperatures were to rise to 3%, right? So the temperature rise could affect the economy in a very, very serious way. And here what you can see, the climate costs that were calculated in the document as part of our exercise that was done by the CCDR, that it could be around 10%, right? So very large consequences potentially. Now again, these are estimation. This is based on our colleagues' analysis. Other people will have other estimations, but the idea behind it is what is important, is that this is not you can avoid this kind of high cost by taking action. Now, somebody else may come and say, oh, the climate cost impact is 5%. But again, 5% is a lot of your GDP, right? So the idea behind this is that in order to avoid this, there are actions and policies that could be adopted that can help alleviate this and move the economy towards a direction where you would have more resilience, right? Actually, opportunities for growth that are promising. Moving forward, basically then, what we have is the CCDR provides ideas and analysis to develop, to move ahead with roadmap for developing a resilient and sustainable economy. We have two: the resilient pathway, which is increasing climate resilience for future development, and that's basically protecting the country's assets, adaptive measures to protect sectors and protect locations, and protecting the most vulnerable. And I think this is actually along the line of what Delphine was talking about adaptation. Then there's also the decarbonization pathway. Now there, Vietnam is not a huge contributor to the global emissions, but still going forward, to benefit its own country, the country itself, it would be potentially something to consider. One of the issues that Vietnam faces, especially for us who live in Hanoi, is severe pollution. And that has had a lot of health consequences for children, for the elderly, for people who have sensitivities with their breathing, et cetera, asthmas. And as was also, I think, one of our colleagues was mentioning, was that there's a lot of death associated with air pollution. And also, one of the things that we've noticed is Vietnam is a very, very successful exporter, and has done export-led growth in a very, very successful way in the past 20, 25 years. Major provider of goods to the US, to EU, and a big part of the GVCs, global value chains. Now, what we're seeing is a lot of the companies now in the West are adopting net zero carbon policies. And a lot of the clients, a lot of people who buy products want to see greener products. They want to see products that are produced more greenly or transported greenly and damage the environment less. This is starting to have a consequence on the global value chains. And we see that, for example, in companies like Apple, like Nike, which has a lot of production in Vietnam, where they want to green their production. And so Vietnam going forward would be wise to move ahead quickly with greening its own production and exports to ensure that it remains competitive and even maybe capture more markets going forward. Now, Vietnam, as I mentioned, the cost is going to be very high, but also meeting the goals of building resilience and decarbonization is going to be expensive. We appreciate that. The estimation that we have is around 368 billion over the next 20 years, let's say, which is approximately 6.8% of GDP per year. This is very high. We appreciate that. Most of this cost, though, is associated with the resilience pathway, which is the adaptation pathway. and less of it from the decarbonization. Now, we also note that this cost needs to be shared. You have the public sector. We're hoping that the private sector will be coming in for its own interest and incentives to invest and change the production processes. And of course, we're hoping that there will be external financing available, green bonds, government grants, et cetera, that could help the transition for Vietnam. Going forward, though, can green fiscal policy then come to the rescue? It's a little bit heroic, but it's one of the more important instruments that are available for governments and authorities to use. Now, why does it matter? Because the public sector is pretty much, not only provides incentives, but it also provides services, it provides protection. So it's in all sense of the economic actor, it's a very important actor in Vietnam. Now, as we know, pollutions and what we've seen in terms of pollution is one of the reasons is that we have had market failures. We're not capturing the cost of economic activities on environment properly. And we're not capturing the role of the public goods in terms of incentivizing the public, the producers, the consumers to take on the responsibility of the environmental impact they have. So that, we also when we look at the economy, we look at relative prices of goods and the incentive structure that we have in the economy. And a lot of times, we don't take into account the environmental impact of production or environmental impact of consumption of specific goods. And it's important for us to go ahead.
Share microphone now. Thank you.
It's important for us to take into account how we can incentivize and change the relative prices of goods and services to change people's behaviors, change investment behaviors, and make people take responsibility, but also change their production and consumption patterns, which will then help us build the resilient economies we want going forward and more sustainable economic growth that we want going forward. SOEs are very important in Vietnam. They still play a very important role. Especially in coal, they have a very important role in production of electricity. They have around 85% of output share in the sector is coming from SOEs. For chemicals industry and subsector, the SOEs have a very important role. So again, it's very important to keep them involved and ask them to act and change their behavior and incentivize them to change their behavior. Generally speaking, of course, we know that there's a lot of fiscal risk associated to the budget if you have disasters happening. So the budget itself, the fiscal stance is vulnerable to shocks, especially environmental shocks. You have hurricanes, you have flooding, and all of that has social costs that the government a lot of times has to step in. So there's a lot of contingent liabilities associated with that, with the environmental changes. Well, how does it matter? We've talked about a lot of the elements already, but what I wanted to point out is that obviously revenue policies changing, introducing environmental taxation, non-tax fees, like using of for example, consumption taxes associated with plastic use, or production taxes that are associated with putting out dirty water or dirty air, anything that can basically change the incentive structure as regards to taxation, but also non-tax fees, non-taxation fees. Now, of course, you have the carbon tax. In Vietnam, they at this point have, I think they have an environmental taxation, but they are considering, I think, strengthening that and improving the methodology. Of course, spending policy and management, there's going to be a lot of discussions. I think our colleague from the IMF mentioned this already. There's a lot that can be done to the whole budget cycle, starting from planning and how do you plan, what do you prioritize when you want to green your environment. We look at procurement. Procurement is going to be a critical element because usually the government is a major purchaser of goods and services in the economy, right? So instilling green principles in procurement laws will be critical going forward. And I think actually in Vietnam, the government is reviewing and revising their procurement law and trying to incorporate more sustainable sustainability principles into their procurement law. As I mentioned, SOEs already, a critical element will be to change their pattern of production and change their, the way they kind of provide services. Finally, we talked about fiscal risks. There's a need to develop a whole whole set of instruments associated with fiscal risks. First of all, there's the issue of assessment of public assets. In Vietnam, there's a certain need, obviously, to develop these fiscal assets. And this assessment to understand much better at the national level, but also at the subnational level. What is it that the governments own? And then develop, potentially insurances, other tools that they can use and roll out to protect these assets. How do you, plans for management of operations and maintenance that could be much more green, that could be much more longer term. Management of operations and maintenance, from what I understand in Vietnam, is not as much as it could be, or as useful as it could be in terms of the, protecting the sustainability of products. Finally, financing. I think there will be discussion on it, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But there's green bonds. There's all kinds of different instruments that could be used, including, the carbon market, right? The carbon market where you can then incorporate some benefits from people who are less polluting. All right, so I've already discussed a lot of this. I'm not going to go back through all of it. I already discussed it. So in green taxes and non-tax revenues, we mentioned the sustainability of tax revenues. It's going to be really important to think about green taxation, environmental taxation, carbon taxation, environmental fees and charges we mentioned. On green expenditure policy, we talked about the investment aspect, the prioritization of adaptation, green procurement, green assets, fiscal risk, SOEs. The one thing I missed is actually also very important is the green tagging, budget tagging. Can the authorities already, or hopefully in the near future, identify the budget lines that are going to be green, right? Or are going to be green expenditures, or helping to green the government's activities through the budget. Finally, we talked about green financing, green bond, carbon markets, and of course, the role of the private sector. Now, going forward, there's a lot of areas of, I have put this up, and it's in the presentation. There's 6 slides that goes into details about all of this stuff that I talked about. But given the fact that we don't have that much time, I'm going to spare you. And I'm happy to talk about it, and Krian also, I'm sure, will be happy to talk about it. It kind of details the rationale for intervention in each of these areas that we talked about. It talks about what Vietnam has done so far, and also provides suggestions about what can be done, right? So you will see, this is all the discussions that we had. I brushed on each of these topics very briefly. Okay, there's much more that can be discussed. So basically, the takeaways I want to finish with is that fiscal policy is, of course, one of the main instruments to facilitate investment, both in mitigation, but also in adaptation programs. It can be a major driver of the direction of the economy and policymaking. Now, it can also be helpful in adjusting and incentivizing change in behavior. And that's, I think, even more powerful because the economy as a whole is, of course, larger than the budget. So if you can change people's behaviors in private sector and consumer behaviors, it's also a major, major achievement. So, it will help balance the pricing, it will help the redistribution of resources, and will be supported by the financing mechanism. Finally, fiscal policy will need to be accompanied by other sectoral policies and financial sector measures to be effective. I mean, obviously, you have to have your energy sector policy be lined up to become green so that the fiscal policy can impact it. Or you need to have the financial sector develop the financing tools like green bonds, et cetera, or the carbon market, so for the fiscal policy to be effective. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop here. I'm around, so I'm happy to answer questions right after the coffee break. Thank you.